Good afternoon and welcome to today's ACPE Academy webinar. My name is Mark Medwed and I'm the Program Manager at the ACPE. Today is the third installment of our webinar series about the job search process. Our topic today is interviewing for a staff chaplain position and is once again presented by Richard Thorne, the President of Thorne Consulting. The handouts that Richard will reference in today's webinar are available for download from the ACPE Academy webpage. At the conclusion of the presentation today, there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions. When you move your mouse on the screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Click on the button and type your question. Please know that depending on the number of questions that are asked, it may not be possible to answer all of them as part of the webinar. You may type your questions at any time, and they will appear for Richard to see. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback from the ACPE Academy webpage, along with a copy of the PowerPoint and all the handouts. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Richard Thorne.
Our number 3, and thanks for coming back. Similar to what we did last week, I would just like to sort of remind us of some of the things that we've already talked about, some of the things that we've already covered. And while each week in a sense can stand on its own, at the same time, they can build on and serve each other as well. So the first week, if you'll recall, we talked about setting a vision, developing the tools and tactics necessary for really moving forward and fulfilling that vision for yourself. And we talked quite a little bit and have re-emphasized since then just that whole idea of really becoming familiar with yourself, really who you are in the workplace and what and how you contribute in unique ways. And then last week we talked about exciting things like resumes and cover letters, but also introduced a couple of concepts, headlines, and bring them forward. So those pieces that we've covered so far, I sort of consider them more or less the written pieces, sort of the foundational pieces for everything that you hope will happen, and that is actually having various conversations and opportunities to meet with people and really share with them in a more personal way who you are and what you do and how you can really come in and help their organization. One of the things that I just kind of bring back to your attention as you go into an interview process and begin sort of that stage of the job search, there are a lot of people out there that will be happy to tell you that you're a chicken, and don't listen to them, and don't forget that in fact you are the eagle, because people are happy to help us not fulfill our dreams quite often. And sometimes people have suggested that if you really have something you want to accomplish, you more or less keep it to yourself so people don't rain on your parade. Let's see. So today we're going to talk about interviewing, and we'll really talk about it in 3 different types. And again, pieces from one also transfer to another, so it's not like some of these things only apply in one particular situation, but chances are they apply kind of across the board. But oftentimes for time and for cost effectiveness, more and more people will do telephone and Skype interviews or FaceTime interviews with you, and then as a second stage or beyond, actually do face-to-face interviews. So we'll be looking at those 3 different types or formats of interviewing and really looking at them, and some of the examples that will be used will be focused really on staff chaplains, and next week we'll switch it and put the emphasis in the final webinar of the series on CPE supervisors. One little thing to consider actually, as you begin looking for a job and think about interviewing, is what may be the best ways to actually go about getting the position that you want. And one of the most common ways would be filling out online applications. It's also the way, unfortunately, that more or less gives you the poorest result. So I'll suggest a couple of other ways, and then we'll review a little bit about the informational interview as well. But two concepts to keep in mind that can work for you, and again give you an opportunity to sort of separate yourself from the masses, would be networking and applying directly. Now, with these ideas, you really want to evaluate sort of who you are and how comfortable you are with some of these things. And if you're not particularly comfortable with them, or there's something that feels a little off about them, then don't use them. But they can work if you're comfortable and feeling as though you can use them. So one of the handouts actually that you have today will sorry, I jumped ahead. So networking is really what, in a way, it says it is. So if I were to come up with, say, my list of my top 10 or 15 potential employers, places that I would really want to work, part of what I'm going to want to do is to begin to see if I can identify people who may be able to then help me move into or begin to gain a familiarity with these organizations and who the decision makers might be. And networking really can in a way be anybody that I run into, and that is just beginning to let people know what it is I'm up to, and seeing who they may know that might be good for me to talk to. And really then in that networking, that may lead to somebody who potentially could be a hiring manager. It may lead to another referral of someone who could be a hiring manager, or it may lead to something more along the lines of an informational interview. But once I sort of have these networking folks figured out, I'm going to use them in some capacity similar to doing an informational interview, and that is to have them help me really evaluate how I've positioned myself, how I'm presenting myself, both in terms of cover letters and resumes, and potentially as far as interviews, and getting some ideas from them. I may also be talking to some of these networking sources that I intentionally contact for this purpose, about their willingness, if it's appropriate, and if they know me well enough, to be a reference. So I, again, want to do my homework even at this stage with references to know who I might use and begin to put together that list, and also really pay attention to how people respond to that. People may say that they would be happy to give a reference, but I really want someone on my reference list who's going to enthusiastically promote me, not just sort of give me a grade of a C with an employer. If you're not going to give me an A or an A plus, I need to look elsewhere. And so I'm, again, looking for these networking sources to just can help me expand, if you will, the potential targets that I may go after, with the idea being that then I'm approaching these organizations or these individuals, and it really kind of moves us into the next piece of applying directly, going right to these folks. So if I'm interested in working for XYZ Hospital, for example, or ABC Continuing Care Retirement Community, I want to find out who the hiring manager may be, or who the executive, again, if it were in a continuing care retirement community, I may actually start here depending on the size of the organization, who the executive is that really runs the show, so to speak. So I want to really be talking with decision makers who can either make a decision on whether they might hire me or not, or they can direct me to the person who would. But I would rather start higher in the organization and be referred down than start down and try to work my way up. So that would be the idea there. And then once I'm comfortable, and that may mean having done a couple of informational interviews, or another idea that can make a lot of sense is that if you have your list of target organizations, maybe there's a second list, sort of the B standard, if you will, of a few organizations, and you work to see if you can interview with those organizations. So in other words, practice where you don't want to work first, or you think you don't want to work first. And then as you become better, then you move toward the organizations where you'd really like to work. And I don't honestly care in approaching an organization, if I'm you, whether they have an opening or not. I'm looking at going to the potential hiring manager, the decision maker, and letting them know of my availability, letting them know of my strengths and backgrounds and how I might be able to contribute to their organization, and then finding out if they would be interested in having someone with that skill set actually as part of their team. And if they don't have an opening now, I'll simply talk to them about how typically they fill positions and how often opportunities come up, and then decide if that's a good place to continue to knock on the door periodically or not. And if it's not, I may then turn that person into a networking source. But again, the idea with both networking and applying directly is that I'm going right to decision makers and stating my case as best I can, versus being one of 50, 60, 100 people who fill out the online application, and I may somehow magically get pulled from the pile, or I may not. This way, I'm doing my best to really get an audience with the person who could make the decision. But again, the caveat there is you need to be comfortable being that direct and calling an organization, for example, and saying, I'm wondering if you could tell me the name of your director of spiritual care. Oh, okay, thank you. And their phone number and email address if you have it? Great, thank you very much. And now I'm going to make a direct contact with that person, or perhaps send them a letter of introduction, maybe not with a resume, and sort of do things sequentially. With the informational interview, again, we've talked about this briefly before, but the idea there is that at the outset, when I'm still trying to sort of figure out how the whole process works, I may contact 2 or 3 people whose perspectives I would really appreciate, and who may also be good networking resources for me, and just simply talk to them about looking for work, the kinds of things. If they know about me, great. If they don't know too much, share with them a little bit of the kinds of things that I've done. Perhaps in that, ask them if there are things that they're not hearing, that if they were in a position of hiring, they would like to hear or would need to hear. Ask them potentially to take a quick look at my resume and see if there's anything there that is outstanding, either plus or minus. Talk to them perhaps a little bit about the kinds of interview questions that they typically ask, and if there are questions where candidates typically stumble, I might ask them what those questions may be, and I would also be asking them what in many cases, what would they be looking for in the response? In other words, what would be a good, solid response? I guess I think about it sort of in answering essay questions and how they used to be graded, and it's like, okay, there's 6 key points to make or something like that. So I would be looking for that kind of guidance with people. And at the end, while I'm not asking for a job, I would use this as an opportunity to at least ask them if they would, accept a copy of my resume and leave that with them. And maybe make a plan to, again, if I'm comfortable asking, to follow up with them. And once I've got that informational process down and I'm fairly comfortable and I sort of know what's going on, I guess these in some ways are in reverse order, then I may move into the networking and applying directly, or you can use all of them simultaneously. Again, one of the things really to keep in mind, a little piece perhaps, is to interview where you don't want to work first. In other words, practice, and then go after the organizations that would be of most interest to you. Another maybe fairly obvious kind of thing, but something to keep in mind, is once I make some sort of connection, whether it's an email or a voicemail message or whatever it is, but once I've somehow made some form of connection with an organization, from that point forward, and including that point, really everything that I'm doing becomes part of the selection process. So you want to be thought out. You want to be intentional about what you're doing. And that can even be as simple as, oh, somebody's calling from a place that I may have applied for a position, but I'm not really in a space where it would be good to answer the phone, whatever that circumstance may be. So I won't answer, and as quickly as I can, I'll try to change that circumstance so that I can call them back. But I just want to be aware of those things so that sort of these little miscellaneous pieces don't somehow cause me to stub my toe unintentionally. I had an experience several years ago. I was actually looking for a dean for a school of health sciences. And I called this one person, and at the time, he was a substitute teacher. And I don't think before I called him that I knew that. But I called, and I still don't really understand this, but he had his cell phone and he had it turned on in class. And he answered the phone. And the students were in the background, as they often were when I was in school, with the substitute teacher being kind of raucous. And he literally yelled, "You kids, shut up!" And I thought, well, yeah, probably not the guy we're going to pursue for this position. And it was just like, wow. I'm sure he may not have given it a second thought, but it certainly created an impression with me, and he was off our preferred candidate list very quickly. So the point again is that you want to be aware and just really set up the circumstances once you've started in the process to make sure that you're being very, very intentional about what it is that you are that you're doing at the time. So again, more or less, there are three types of interviews that we'll talk about today, and again, telephone, Skype or FaceTime, and face-to-face. As we get into this, I would just caution you to not make a bigger deal out of interviews than they are. It's actually just a conversation. It may be a very important conversation, but it's just a conversation, and the future of all mankind doesn't actually rise and fall with the interview. It's really just a couple of people trying to get to know each other better. And if you're able to sort of lift some of that heaviness or pressure from yourself for the interview, you can recognize that hopefully that it really is something you've been doing all your life. You've been meeting people in unknown situations. You've introduced yourself. You've created an impression. Sometimes that ends up in a match, in a friendship, or something more. Other times you go, wow, we had that experience and we really don't need to repeat that one. And that's what interviewing is. It's questions and answers. It's buying and selling. And keep in mind too, if people are talking with you, they've already seen something in you that's attractive. And so be positive. Do your best to not appear desperate, and most of all, don't overcomplicate the situation. I'm a little cautious here because some of this could be open to misinterpretation, but the reality of it is, to a degree, with a little bit of a governor on, perhaps you want to be yourself. So thinking then, sort of about the interview, and this gets to the handout that I referred to earlier. It's titled "Keeping It Simple," but and I won't read the whole thing to you, but the essence of it really is that there are three things to keep in mind as we begin to interview, whatever type of interview it may be, and that is understand what's really being asked. So, pay attention and know what the question is. Provide concise, organized, and positive answers, and provide responses that emphasize your related skills and abilities. So as I look at the handout, just a couple of points to emphasize under each one of those. Under the first one, the second bullet, when you're unclear as to what's being asked, either rephrase the question in your own words and confirm that it's what's being asked, or ask the interviewer to restate the question. And again, I might use rephrase twice, because what I don't actually want I could say restate. What I don't want to say is repeat, because I don't want them to say the same thing to me a second time, because that's not really going to help in terms of clarifying things. So again, what I would do here if I have a question about the question is that I may go, if I'm understanding what you'd like me to talk with you about, you'd like to hear something about my most difficult experience as a chaplain resident. What was my biggest challenge? And then it's just kind of I stop and they say yes or they say no. And if they say no, hopefully they'll clue me in as to what it is that they are looking for. I don't want to do that with every question, obviously, because at some point we go, okay, what we have here is a failure to communicate. So you can use that, but you can only use it a couple of times maybe over the course of an interview. And the other way simply is to say, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking. I'm wondering if you could just state that question in a different way for me. Thank you. I would say that after they restated it. And then the other thing is if after giving the answer, you're just feeling a little bit uncertain as to whether you've really hit the target or not, you can always ask. So again, does that address what you were wanting to hear about, or would you like me to say more about that? Whatever it may be. But again, you can do that. The idea being that I really want to ask versus having people assume, because when they assume, they'll assume in the negative, and that won't do me any favors. So I really want to understand what the question is. And I'm sure we've all had conversations with people who maybe you're just getting to know, and you have one of those things where it's like, wow, I have no idea where that came from. And whatever you were talking about or asking them about, they came with something out of left field and it just didn't make any sense. If that happens a couple times in an interview, and particularly on dealing with the hiring manager, they're going to assume that communication for the two of us would be a real struggle. Again, I want to provide concise and positive responses. So I want to have thought through what possible questions may be asked. I want to develop, at least in bullet point form, how I would respond to those questions. And I then want those to be fairly tight. I don't want them to feel brief or rehearsed, but I do want them to be sort of logically organized so that things flow and it's easy for people to follow. And I always want to be positive. Again, in the interview process, people are looking for the negative. So if someone were to ask me something where maybe I have little or no experience, rather than saying, gosh, I've really never done that, and I may have to say that at some point, but what I would like to do first is just take a second and go, in my background, and I'm doing this in my head, not out loud, in my background, what have I done that comes closest to matching what they're asking me about? And I'll give them my best answer. Even if it's weak, most of the time it's better than just saying, nope, don't have it. A couple of nope, don't have it, and the interview basically is done. So again, a couple of the things to emphasize there, as I said, keep answers tight, thorough, and logically organized. Have an identifiable beginning, middle, and end. Be congruent with what you say. This is the third bullet. How you say it and what your body says. In other words, people will be looking oftentimes for how is the message matching all of the other things that I'm hearing and seeing. Because again, part of it is even if the words are not always right, your passion and your enthusiasm may help to override some of those things. Even if your experience isn't, but your energy is higher than other people's, that may go a long way with a potential interviewer. And another thing to keep in mind, and this is the fourth bullet, one of the things to just kind of keep in mind is the idea of silence. Silence can be your friend or it can be your foe. In other words, if I'm thinking, gosh, how do I want to answer that question? Then silence and pausing for a minute may be my friend, because if I get something out there and it's a wrong thing or something like, gosh, I wish I hadn't said that. Once it's out there, it's pretty hard to dial it back. So that sort of silence can be valuable. If an interviewer goes silent, and a skilled interviewer actually would do this, the thing that you want to not do is to feel as though you have to fill in that silence with chatter. Oftentimes when we do that, again, that's where we commit an error that we pretty much can't undo and say something pretty crazy. And particularly coming through a CBE process, sometimes with an emphasis on disclosure and openness, that craziness can be pretty crazy. So you want to keep that in mind and just be aware of that. And then again, your reference point is your skills, your background, the kinds of experiences that you've had. So answer by referencing your related skills, experiences, and accomplishments. And with that, one of the very simple things to keep in mind is to talk about what you've done, not what we did. If there was something that was done as a group, what was your part in that group, and talk about that. If you talk about we, the assumption may very well be that you didn't do it. The group or someone else did, but your role was pretty minimal. So you want to keep that in mind. And then again, keep in mind the CART stories as a great way to really help share with people the kinds of things that you're capable of achieving and how they really match their situation. So that's sort of a framework for all of the interviews. And then within that, you have a telephone interview. So part of that, I guess, and maybe this goes without saying, but it sometimes doesn't. So I don't mean to overstate the obvious, but keep in mind that this is a real interview. you are being evaluated, and people are paying attention to what it is you're saying and how you're saying it. So with that in mind, many of the things that follow sort of support that. That is, I want to have an area that's quiet. I want to make sure that the phone I have is working, charged if that's what I need, and that I'm in a place where I have consistently good connection. I also want to make sure that there are no other outside disturbances. So if I'm doing this from home and I have a family, I need to be able to sort of move myself away from them for a while, whether it be dogs, cats, people, whatever it is, as best I can. I want to be able to really focus on and give the person or people that I'm interviewing with my full attention and treat it professionally like any other interview. Yeah, so it is real. You want to be aware. Oftentimes, I talked a little bit about sort of that energy or that passion that you bring to the work. In a phone interview, your voice does that. And so you want to be aware of your voice and make sure that it has a certain aliveness and a certain energy. And sometimes, if you're feeling a little bit low, for whatever reason, it can help just to stand up. And in standing up, it oftentimes will increase that energy and a little bit even the volume of your voice. Just like any other interview, again, you want to do your research. So know some things about the organization. Oftentimes you can find it on the website or other ways. Most of you are probably much more sophisticated at doing internet research than I am. But you want to have done your homework. It can work a couple of ways for you. If you haven't, people will recognize that and think that you're not really serious. If you have, you oftentimes positively impress them, and if you've done it well, you may, just with that piece, you may have differentiated yourself from many of the other people with whom they may be talking. In a phone interview, another thing that you can do is, if you filled out an online application, if you have a resume, if you have their job posting, whatever it is, you can have those things in front of you, and you can refer to them, and you can take notes. Now, I would want to be careful that I'm not referring to those things or taking notes to a point that I'm missing out on the conversation, or it feels like I've somehow disconnected or left the room while people are talking with me. But I can have those things available to me. You want to have some prepared questions. In other words, oftentimes at the end of an interview, someone might say, well, do you have any questions for me, or do you have any questions for us? About the worst answer that I could give would be, oh, no, I don't. That pretty much tells someone in no uncertain terms that you're really not very interested in them. And because obviously you don't have enough interest to even be curious or want further information about something that was talked about. So if you go back to your vision and think about what are the things that I'm looking for and what is it that I would really like to have in a position, this is where that can come in. And what I would suggest, and we'll look at it in a little bit further, is that you want these questions to be broad. In other words, you want to understand the big picture as opposed to getting into real narrow details. So it really doesn't make any difference what time my lunch break may be. But it may make a difference, for example, as to the units that I would be working on, or something like that. So I want to have questions prepared that are important to me. At the end, I want to be gracious. I want to express an interest, even if I may not be interested or think I'm not interested. I still want to express an interest, because again, if I don't, I probably can't recover that later. If I do, I can always tell somebody in the future, gosh, I've kind of reflected on our conversation and just decided that your organization really wouldn't be the best fit for me. It's just not a match. But I do want to then go on and say, so what's next? Where do we go from here? And at the end, just some do's and don'ts. Probably don't do the phone interview in a car. Avoid slang, avoid eating while you're in the interview, avoid drinking. Those kinds of things are good to not be doing. The other type of interview, another type of interview that's becoming increasingly more popular, I think, based on time and cost, would be the idea of Skype video or FaceTime. And part of that, just like here now for me with you all, is remember that people can see you. So whatever appropriate professional attire is, that's how I want to be dressed. I also don't want a lot of disturbances in the background, whatever that might be. So I want the background to be probably pretty much plain vanilla. And I want to do my best without feeling like I'm staring at people. I want to do my best to really maintain a consistent eye contact with folks throughout. And that's, at least in this experience for me with you all, but that's a little more challenging than maybe we think. You want to be comfortable with the technology, whatever it is. I know when I first did this with Mark and we set things up, he said, okay, you're going to need to move your computer a little bit because right now the camera doesn't show you. And so it is something that I've tried to pay attention to within reason. So I want to make sure that I've got that. I want to make sure that I know how the technology works. I also would suggest that you at least consider, if the organization doesn't think about it, offering for this sort of thing a backup plan. In other words, if the technology is failing, what phone number can I call to reach you so we can continue the interview? Because in my experience with people doing this, it seems like about half the time on one end or another it doesn't work. Some organizations are really not set up to do these kinds of things, and so people kind of cobble it together and it may not work that well. If it's not working, one of the things there, a little piece to keep in mind, is be patient, because if I were to grow impatient or frustrated, obviously an employer is looking at that and will take that into consideration as well as they consider me as a candidate. Usually as things move up, a phone or a Skype interview may be a little more in depth than phone, a little longer, maybe seems a little more intimate, maybe the questions are a little bit deeper, a little more challenging. And then, as I mentioned, hold your focus. So again, research and some of the things that we talked about with phone interviews, those same things apply here. Making sure that I've set myself up well for the interview and prepared the space and all of that so that I'm really focusing on the audience would be important too. And then the last type of interview, or at least for our purposes today, would be the face-to-face interview. And this may be one interview, it may be multiple interviews, it may be meeting with multiple people on the same day. It may be multiple people at the same time. Part of what I want to do, and part of my preparation, really not only for this interview but for any of the others, is whether it probably would be the person making the arrangements, which may be someone in the office, or it may be the hiring manager. But I would like to really know what the agenda is. In other words, who are the people I'll be meeting with? What are the titles of those people, if that's available? And if they're able to maybe give me just one or two things about the person's background. They're a staff chaplain and they work the ED, or this person has been with the organization 15 years or whatever it may be, but a little bit to give me a context. I also would ask the person, and again, you need to be comfortable doing this, but I would ask them if there are any particular things that people will be looking to hear about, things that they may like to talk about, particular areas of interest. And often it has to do with either something that the person before me did and did well and people appreciated, or the flip side of that, things that the person didn't do or did poorly, and people are not wanting to have that repeated. There was a survey done some time ago in terms of face-to-face interviews, and what they discovered really is that oftentimes the reason a person isn't hired or doesn't move forward in a selection process has to do with personal appearance. I'm going to take that just a little bit further, and what's said is actually that sort of that positive first impression that's talked about, just like somebody looking at your resume. We talked about it in that context too. It takes about 6 seconds, and so that initial eye contact, that initial posture, what I have on should match pretty much what the culture of that organization says I should have on, and the quality of my handshake. All of those things come together in my mind and sort of create part of that appearance and create that initial judgment. And if you want to play a game with yourself, if you're meeting some people maybe for the first time, or even if you've met them, just kind of pay attention to it if you can slow it down. And just see what kind of thoughts you have in that initial engagement period, and sort of see where that goes, and then recognize, okay, oftentimes in an interview situation, that's what people will be doing, so I just need to be really aware of it. And if I tend to be a little bit introverted, but I can come on strong for even 15 seconds, good posture, good handshake, good eye contact, strong voice, hi, I'm glad to meet you. I've created an impression, and what I do from there on, while it's still important, that initial impression will be part of what really sticks with people. You want to, particularly for face-to-face, because it's going to be fairly in-depth, is to make sure that you've really done your homework, done your research. Think about interviews that you had, and these could be interviews you've had with the organization up to this point in time, phone or Skype interviews. What kind of things were talked about? What kind of, what were your answers? Because you're looking for two things. One, you're looking for consistency, and two, you're looking and going, is there something I wish I had said when I was asked that question that I didn't? Just in case, because just because a question's been asked once doesn't mean it won't be asked again. And some organizations are pretty formulaic with their questions. So you could interview with 3 different groups of people, and they all have the same question sheet. They will all be evaluating you in a sense based on the same questions. So it's not unlikely that you'll hear things over again. So you just, again, want to think about that. You might even think about other interviews that you've had and things that you answered there, or perhaps a question or two that really made it difficult for you. And again, talking with the hiring manager about what some of the focuses or emphasis of the interview may be. Think through the questions that may be asked, and again, come up with your potential responses, and also think about questions that you want to ask. And again, you think about that funnel idea. So that is going from the broader questions down to the more specific as you get a handle on the big picture. And the OEM is actually what we'll look at next, and that stands for opportunity, employer, and manager. And so what I would suggest to you through the interview process is that those are the areas that you want to ask your questions in. So if you want to ask about the position, you want to ask about the organization, and you want to be asking about the person or people that you'll be working with. I'm not asking about compensation. I'm not necessarily at these stages asking about schedule or any of those kinds of things. I'm waiting to do that for a time when I've actually sold them on the fact that I'm an employee of choice. And then at that appropriate time, we will we will talk about those things. I also want to make sure that I have with me extra copies of my resume and my reference list that I can leave with them as part of that interview process. So those are sort of the types of interviews and some tips as to what you might do in preparation, and just thinking about some of the kinds of things that you might run into. And then the second handout, and I'm just going to draw your attention to it and let you read it at your own leisure, is titled Common and Avoidable Interviewing Mistakes. So for instance, failing to make eye contact. I would look at that and make sure that there's nothing obvious from that list that I'm doing as best I can judge it. And then we actually get into, okay, so those are some of the things to do in advance of the interviews and during the interviews. Now you get into the types of questions that may be asked. And so the pretty obvious one is oftentimes is tell me or tell us about yourself. And usually when so you go back with these questions and go, so what's really being asked? And oftentimes there it's like, share with us, if you would, your recent experiences and your recent accomplishments. So really telling people professionally about yourself. If you were me, why would you hire yourself? And again, a question like that has to do with what are your particular skills? What are your particular gifts? What are your strengths? Why are the reasons we should actually be considering you? Describe for me what your typical day is currently. Again, looking for those, all of these are really different ways of trying to find out more about your background and what you would bring to the organization. With that as well, people very easily in that question could be looking for a match. How closely does what your typical day looks like match what a typical day might look like in our organization? What motivates you to do your best work? In other words, is what motivates you something that our culture may offer? If it doesn't, we might have a problem. What was it that caused you to choose a career in chaplaincy? In other words, what's motivated you to come into this field, and what sense of sort of commitment do you have to it? And often an answer I might hear is something about calling, and while that's good, I would challenge you to come up with a little bit more if you can. What's your availability? That could have to do with a couple of things. One is it could have to do with how quickly can you start. The other may have to do with schedule. And so if someone were to ask me that question like that, I might ask for clarification, because in many cases it may have to do with, well, every third weekend you're on call or whatever it is, and you go, well, gosh, I have a parish ministry that I need to attend to. That may be something where I wouldn't say much, and then I would try to figure out, again, you have to sort of determine for yourself what's important. What's your salary expectation? Pretty obvious, but it's amazing how often people stumble on that question. So do your homework there. Know what you're worth and what the going rates are in your particular area. What's the most difficult challenge you've ever faced as a chaplain? Again, there's a perfect opportunity for a CART story. And what interests you about this opportunity? In other words, I want to know from you that we're special. If you can't tell me that there's something unique about us that attracts us to you, then I'm probably not very interested in you either. So I want to have thought about and be able to answer those kinds of questions. And then the second part of it is preparing your own questions. Now, one of the caveats here is, as an interviewer, if you were to ask me a question, I may flip it back to you. So make sure you know how you'd answer your own questions. May go without saying, but I think sometimes people are surprised. And again, when I think about sort of that funnel concept, I want to make sure that I really understand what the day-to-day responsibilities of the role are. In other words, if you were to hire me for this position, what is it that I'm really doing? And it's one thing to read a posting or a job description or something else. It's another thing to find out, if I were really here, what would this look like? What are the qualities you're looking for in the person you want to hire? And for me that goes beyond just a master's in divinity or whatever it may be, but it really gets into more of some of the traits or attributes that we're looking for in somebody. So we're looking for somebody flexible. We're looking for somebody who's self-motivated, whatever it may be. And as people give me their answers, if I can, I will do my best to add a little piece about how I fit that. So as I get the answer, it's go, wow, that's interesting. Yeah, because actually in my final evaluation from my supervisor, they described me exactly that way. Something like that. But just to reinforce it, to bring it home. What are the major concerns that need to be immediately addressed? In other words, day one, what do I need to put my attention on? And again, based on what those needs are and what my experiences are, I would want to re-emphasize to them, or emphasize if I haven't covered it yet, that what you need to have fixed right away happens to be right in my wheelhouse. If I were to get the job, how do I earn a gold star? In other words, what do I need to do to really be outstanding in your mind? And again, that can be different than what some formal piece of paper says, and gives me an insight into what the real priorities of the position are. And this question I may put here, I may put it at the end. Probably I'd put it at the end. But the idea, and again, you have to be comfortable asking a question this bold, is there anything you've seen in other candidates that you're seriously considering that you've not seen in me? Or anything you've heard from other candidates that you've not heard from me? In other words, do we have any loose ends? Does it feel to you like there's something I'm missing? And if there is, please tell me now, because I want to make sure that I let you know before we stop that, in fact, I have those things. You want to look as well at the employer and understand sort of what the priorities are, what the organization's goals and expectations are, perhaps how the department is perceived by the organization in general, attributes of the types of people typically that have been successful in the organization. And it may be as simple as, with the person or people I'm interviewing with, what is it about this organization that's attracted you and caused you to stay? And I may want to know as well about professional development opportunities and how that's supported in the organization. So again, asking questions about the organization and looking for myself within that to see if what I'm looking for matches what they seem to have, if their culture is a fit for me. And then I also want to understand the manager. And a lot of people aren't comfortable with this, but I might just ask them to share with me their background and how they got into the position that they're in, so that I have a sense of them and sort of what they've gone through to get where they are. I may ask them about their management style, and part of a component of management style would be, I may make some mistakes. How would we deal with that? From your perspective, what's the biggest challenge that the organization has gone through in the last year? And another one, and I like this one, some of you may not, but what can I do in this position if it's offered to me to make your job easier? How can I make your life better? How can I make you look better? How can I make you more valued by the organization? So I would do that. And if you don't have time, or for some reason these questions about the organization, rather the opportunity, the employer and the manager aren't able to come up, or you're not comfortable doing it, make sure that you at least ask the closing question. And the closing question can be as simple as, what's next? I'm really excited. I like what we've talked about here. Where do we go from here? What's next? Again, if I don't ask that, I can be pretty sure that people will assume I'm not interested. It's kind of like going on a date and saying, wow, I really had a good time, I'd like to do this again, versus sort of turning around and running away. And that will, that will kind of create an impression. The next couple of pieces, the interview follow-up, is fairly self-explanatory. So in deference to time, I'm going to let you kind of read through those, but there are different ideas for follow-up after interviews and thank you notes and potential content and timing for those things. And flip it open to questions and answers. So if anybody has a question, we can answer it. If there are no questions, we'll call it a wrap. Yes, so the question is, and that's a good question. Maybe Mark can answer this, because I know this session is recorded.
Yes, and the PowerPoint slides will be available on the website as well.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, gosh, I guess I was really thorough, and all of your questions regarding job search have been answered. I actually would tell you this as we go. This is kind of it's really an introduction. If we were to think about it, it's like any one of these topics or things that we've covered, we could easily spend an entire day on. But hopefully it gives you a foundation and something to begin to move forward with. And it's been an honor for me to be with those of you who may not be with us next week when we focus on CPE supervisors. And I wish you all much success in the job search, and certainly down the road, if I can be of assistance to you, you have contact information there. So thank you. It's been my privilege.
Thank you, Richard, for today's presentation, and to everyone for joining us today. And as a reminder, in addition to the PowerPoint slides and handouts, the recording of the webinar will be uploaded to the ACPE Academy webpage, which you can find on the ACPE website under the Resources tab. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.